The maid knocks twice. No answer. She's got a master key and a schedule to keep, so she lets herself into room 2805, expecting an empty room and a made bed to strip. Instead, she finds a duvet that's never been touched, folded and stowed like nobody slept there at all. One bed made, one bed untouched, a woman's coat on a hanger, no suitcase open, no toothbrush by the sink, no wallet on the nightstand. It's the kind of room that looks lived in and looks abandoned at the same time, and she can't quite say why that unsettles her, but it does. She has no idea that in 2 days a gunshot is going to come from behind that door, and when they finally get it open, they're going to find a woman who spent her last hours on Earth making absolutely sure that nobody would ever know who she was. This is Still Unexplained. Brief explorations of unsolved mysteries. My name is Mark. Oslo. In the early summer of 1995, it was a city that had quietly become one of the most important places on Earth, and almost nobody outside a very small circle knew it. The Cold War had ended, but the world it left behind was still sorting itself out, and Norway, neutral, discreet, and comfortable hosting people who didn't want to be noticed, had become a favorite meeting ground for diplomats working things out, far from the cameras. Just 2 years earlier, secret talks held quietly in the Norwegian countryside had produced the original Oslo Accords between Israel and the Palestinian Liberation Organization. By 1995, the follow-up talks, what would become known as Oslo II, were still very much alive, and the kind of people who make history happen in hotel conference rooms were moving through the city with some regularity. Sitting right in the middle of all of this was the Oslo Plaza Hotel, a glass tower that was at the time one of the tallest buildings in Norway. It was the kind of hotel built for exactly this moment in history. 5 stars, international clientele, a lobby full of people who spoke 4 languages and gave away nothing with their faces. It was neutral ground in the truest sense. The kind of place where a Belgian businessman and a Russian trade representative and an Israeli negotiator could all be checked in on the same floor and nobody would think twice about it. On the night of May 31st, a woman walked up to the front desk. She was slim, about 5 foot 2 inches, 148 pounds, with short dark hair that may or may not have been dyed. She gave her name as Jennifer Fairgate. She listed a home address on Rue de la Station in the Belgian town of Verlin. And she said she'd been sharing the room with a companion, a man she registered as Louis Fairgate. She didn't hand over a passport. She didn't hand over a credit card. In 1995, at a 5-star hotel, that wasn't unheard of. People still paid cash. Nobody at the desk thought it was strange enough to remember clearly, at least not until it mattered. She checked into room 2805 on the 28th floor, and for the better part of the next 3 days, she was there and she wasn't. Keycard records show she left her room after midnight and came back around 8:30 in the following morning. A housekeeper found the room empty around lunchtime on June 1st. Then sometime between 9 a.m. on June 2nd, she came back after being gone for somewhere between 20 and 24 hours. Nobody knows where. That evening, she ordered room service, bratwurst, and potato salad, and left a generous tip. It's a strange thing to fixate on, but I do. Whatever was happening in that room, whoever this woman really was, she still tipped well for a plate of sausage and potato salad the night before she died. At 7:50 the following evening, June 3rd, a hotel security guard knocked on her door. She hadn't settled her bill, and hotel policy required a card on file, so he'd come to sort it out. As he stood in the hallway, he heard a gunshot from inside the room. Now here's the part that still bothers investigators, nearly 30 years later. He didn't go in. He went to find a supervisor. It took 15 minutes before anyone actually opened the door. When they finally did, they found her lying on the bed, dead from a gunshot wound to her forehead. A Browning 9mm pistol was in her hand, manufactured in Herstal, Belgium, sometime between 1990 and 1991. The room was locked from the inside, and that, on the surface, should have been the whole story, a tragic, private ending, and nothing more. Except almost nothing else in that room made sense. Every label had been removed from her clothing, not torn out carelessly. Removed, cut, and picked away with the kind of patience that takes real time. She had beautiful clothes, expensive jackets, a trench coat, silk pajama shorts, and exactly one label left anywhere in the entire wardrobe, a gray blazer from the designer René Luzard. She had multiple jackets and sweaters, but she had no trousers, no skirts, nothing for her lower body except those silk shorts. There was no passport in the room, no wallet, no keys, no toothbrush. The serial number on the pistol hadn't been scratched off. It had been etched away with acid, the kind of removal that takes real skill and real tools, not something you do in a panic in a hotel bathroom. Investigators found 34 rounds of ammunition total, most of it packed neatly in the briefcase. That is not what a spontaneous, desperate act usually looks like. And then there was the watch. Among all of her elegant, understated clothing, she wore a Citizen Aqualand, model CQ 102150, on her wrist. This isn't a fashion piece. It's a rugged dive watch with a depth gauge and a no decompression chart printed right on the strap. The kind of tool issued to combat swimmers. The kind worn by elite maritime units like the Danish Frogman Corps and the British Special Boat Service. On a woman dressed for a 5-star hotel lobby, it looked completely out of place, like she'd grabbed the wrong watch out of 2 different lives. Here's where I have to stop and let that sit for a second, because this is the moment in the case that made the hair on my arm stand up the first time I read about it. This isn't the profile of a woman having a private crisis in a hotel room. This is the profile of someone who was trained, someone who knew exactly how to disappear and had clearly done it before, at least in practice, if not for real. So here's where it gets complicated, because once you start pulling on these threads, the official ruling starts to look less and less like the whole story. Let's start with the ruling itself. Police called it a suicide, and they called it that with what they described as a 99.9% certainty. This theory holds up in one very real sense. The door was locked from the inside. The gun was in her hand, and there was no sign of forced entry. If you're a police department with a caseload and no ID on the victim, suicide is a conclusion that closes the file. But the forensic details don't sit easily with that conclusion. 2 shots were fired that night, not 1. The first went through a pillow and into the mattress, and the pillow was then flipped over, as if to hide the hole, before the second and fatal shot was fired into her forehead. Despite the violence of a close-range 9mm discharge, there was no gunshot residue on her hands, no blood splatter on her skin, nothing forensically consistent with someone who had just fired that weapon at point-blank range into her own face. And the gun itself? It was found gripped in a way most firearm experts call awkward. Her thumb resting on the trigger, her fingers wrapped around the back of the grip rather than in the neutral firing position. None of that alone proves murder, but together, it's a very uncomfortable list. Now, if intelligence tradecraft is what actually explains this room, the theory that keeps coming back, no matter how many times investigators try to set it aside, is that Jennifer Fairgate was some kind of operative. Former Norwegian intelligence service officer Ola Kaldager has said publicly that stripping labels from clothing and carrying no identifiable pocket litter is intelligence tradecraft, plain and simple. The habits of someone trained to maintain what's called a legend, a fabricated identity built to survive scrutiny. Her stay directly overlapped with sensitive back-channel diplomacy tied to the Oslo II Accords, in a hotel that was quietly known as neutral ground for exactly that kind of work. If she was watching someone, or being watched, the 15-minute gap between the gunshot and the door being opened is exactly the kind of window a trained professional would need to exit a room that a rival with the right tools could relock behind them. Where this theory breaks down, however, is that it requires you to believe someone slipped in and out of a locked hotel room on the 28th floor without leaving a single trace, and nearly 30 years of investigation hasn't produced that trace. This is the version nobody in the official capacity wants to say out loud, and it runs parallel to the intelligence theory rather than replacing it. Organized crime. The mid-1990s were a strange, porous moment in European history when former Stasi and KGB officers, suddenly without an employer, often drifted into organized crime networks that were more than happy to use their training. An acid-etched serial number and a cash transaction with no paper trail fit that world just as easily as they fit an intelligence operation. Where the official explanation runs into a wall it can't get over is the sheer overlap between these two possibilities. Intelligence work and organized crime in that specific place, in that specific decade, weren't always separate categories. Sometimes they were the same people. Now, if you need something that fits inside the ordinary explainable world, here's your best option: the personal disappearance theory. It holds that Jennifer Fairgate was simply a woman in profound distress who wanted to end her life without her family having ever to identify a body or understand her final days. Removing every label, inventing a false identity, none of it, in this reading, is tradecraft. It's a meticulous planning of someone who wanted total control over the one thing she had left. It's a theory that treats her with real compassion, and it deserves that. But it struggles to explain a professionally acid-etched firearm and a tactical dive watch serviced by someone somewhere just months before she died. Grief can be methodical, but it's a much harder case to make that grief is also fluent in acid-etching techniques used to erase a weapon's serial number. And then there's the angle that most researchers quietly return to again and again, which is the eerie mirror this case holds up to an older Norwegian mystery. 25 years earlier, in 1970, a woman known as the Isdal woman was found dead near Bergen, Norway, her body burned beyond recognition. She too had used multiple false identities. She too had every label removed from her clothing. She too had claimed Belgian origins with addresses that led nowhere. Both women had unusually expensive dental work, the kind associated with practices in Germany, Switzerland, or the United States. An isotope analysis on both of them traced their early lives to Germany, with Jennifer specifically linked to what had been East Germany, and a likely birth around 1971. If this is a coincidence, it's an extraordinary specific one. If it isn't, it suggests something a lot stranger than one woman's private tragedy. It suggests a pattern, possibly a standard operating procedure used across decades by people whose job it was to disappear. Now, I'll be honest with you. Of every case I've covered on this show, this is one where I lean hardest towards believing there's something generally extraordinary going on. Something outside the ordinary explanations we reach for first. I don't think a grieving woman etches acid into a gun barrel. I think somebody trained her to do that, or trained someone to do it for her. And I think that training is the reason we still don't have her name. Where things stand now, in case you're wondering, is that her body was exhumed in 2016 for renewed forensic testing, which is where the isotope and carbon dating results came from. Norwegian privacy law currently prevents investigators from running her DNA through commercial genealogy databases, the way so many cold cases have been cracked in the United States, which means one of the most promising tools available to modern investigators is, for now, legally off the table. The Norwegian newspaper VG still runs periodic appeals for information, and somewhere out there, quite possibly, is a watchmaker who once serviced a rugged little dive watch back in March of 1995, and has no idea that a small hand-engraved mark, W395, left on the battery, might be the last remaining thread connecting a dead woman in Oslo to whoever she really was before she became Jennifer Fairgate. That maid, all those years ago, stood in a room that felt both lived in and abandoned, and couldn't say why it bothered her. I think she was picking up on something true. Room 2805 was never really a hotel room. It was a woman's last attempt to make sure the world never found out who she'd been. I don't know about you, but this one's hard to shake. Still Unexplained is created and hosted by me, Mark Evanoff. You can find the show and episode previews at www.stillunexplained.com and follow us on Instagram at StillUnexplainedPod for brief video previews, often featuring actual images and visuals from the case. Please follow wherever you listen, leave a rating or review, and share it with someone who'd appreciate it. I'll see you next time. Thanks for listening.